When the divine descends, you just accommodate. The deepening pilgrimage, the darkening night. It wasn't easy for those who had known him intimately. When Jaggi became Sadhguru, an individual seemed to have turned overnight into an abstraction. The wholeness program had changed an accessible friend and guide into an impersonal figure, a forbidding persona. I struggled with it for a long time, says one of the senior brahmacharinis. The guru-shishya relationship, in my case, hasn't been a smooth one. There have been doubts, rebellions, questions and more questions. I understood that he needed to project himself in a particular way for social reasons, to gain acceptance for the Dhyanalinga and the ashram. But there were some of us who struggled with the change of image, the way in which he seemed to have become a type. It was everything, from his change of clothes to the ever-growing set of ashram norms and rules. Another resident remembers the first time he visited the ashram. Things seemed to be formalizing much too rapidly. Concrete structures were appearing everywhere. His old-time friend was suddenly being addressed as Sadhguru. People around him were suddenly attired in white. Doubt assailed him. What had become of the iconoclastic Jaggi, who was the first to cock a snook at organized spirituality? Had he sold out? If these were the apprehensions at the time, one can imagine the levels of amazement when Jaggi announced that he would be initiating people into brahmacharya. The option to be a lay disciple remained, but brahmacharya was offered as a choice for those who were so inclined. Some were dumbfounded, and yet to others it didn't seem quite so preposterous. It seemed like a way of being with him, and there was nothing else I wanted more, says Kiran. He said it was just a way of being together, of focusing one's energies as a seeker. That made sense, but I'd have done anything just to be around him. Those who were interested were asked to apply. 9 did. Indira was one of them. It wasn't terrifying at the time, because it was all so new. He said we jointly evolved the guidelines as we went along. He was flexible enough at the time to allow me to continue working in my computer firm, which I did for 2 years as a brahmacharini. When the challenges of a career started seeming pointless, I quit and joined the ashram full-time. He was supportive of both decisions. But what was it about? Why would such an obviously contemporary mystic set up a traditional spiritual order? It is a question many wondered at then and continue to wonder at today. I was initially baffled by it too. Here is a man with such seemingly prodigious appetite for life, one whose approach to spirituality is life-affirming and celebratory. Why on earth would he urge others to adopt a life of austerity and self-denial? It seemed totally out of character. Sadhguru laughed when I asked him this question some years ago. That's because you have a limited idea about what it means to be contemporary, he replied. Brahmacharya, he explained, is a tried and tested path for true lovers of freedom. Brahman means the ultimate, the divine. Charya means path. Every human being is in search of joy, knowingly or unknowingly. Because you could not find joy, you settled for pleasure. Pleasure is just a shadow of joy. Beautiful, but very limited. Now, if you are a pleasure seeker, and something that gives you pleasure is taken away from you, you are broken. That means your existence is one of huge bondage, isn't it? Now, no one likes bondage. Everyone has a deep desire for freedom from limitations of all kinds. You can go gold plate your pleasant limitations, but you cannot break them. Most people have gold plated their shackles and are wearing them like ornaments. They're simply celebrating them. But brahmacharya, the path of the divine, means that you are joyful by your own nature. It means that your joy is on self-start, no longer on push-start. And anyway, if the source of happiness is within you, searching for it outside is quite stupid. He often quotes a line by Buddha. Gautama said, "It is better to walk alone than in bad company." If you are alone, you could walk slow or fast, but at least you are walking in a certain direction. It's better than being dragged backwards. Even in traditional Vedic society, he explains, about 70% of the people entered family life. The option of the ascetic part was always open to the remaining 30% who did not experience the same need for family situations. There will always be some people in the world who want more than a life dedicated to self-preservation and procreation. Brahmacharya is for them. Human beings are born alone. These are people who choose to conduct their lives in the same way. They aren't renouncing anything. It's the others in society with libido and attachment problems who are renouncing their freedom to acquire company. He offers the analogy of a mud pot to make his point. Think of yourself as a karmic pot. With the process of living, certain karmas and influences have molded you into a certain type of person. In your childhood, this person was malleable. By the time you're a full-grown adult, it's totally rigid. So this pot is being slowly burnt by the process of life. By the time you're old, if you try to change the shape of the pot, it'll simply break. But when it was unburnt, you could very easily mold it in any way you liked. That's what we're doing with brahmacharya. We're unburning people into a state where their energies become very fluid, very malleable, so we can give them any shape, any form. We can make anything out of them. That's what brahmacharya is working towards. It's a huge sadhana. He once asked me if I thought the brahmacharis looked like zombies. At the time, I replied honestly that the thought had crossed my mind. On my few visits to the ashram, they seemed such shadowy presences, self-effacing to the point of invisibility. It was only later that it struck me just how much maturity it takes not to be the kind of insatiable, attention-seeking entity that contemporary culture deems normal. They're not zombies. They're hugely intelligent people, he assured me. To consciously allow yourself to become so malleable that you can turn yourself into any kind of pot Is it not good to have that freedom? I can combine 10 brahmacharis and make their energies into that of one huge human being. That can be a tremendous force. After a pause, he added, "We've all eaten mangoes, but how many of us have planted mango trees? It's only because 10 people in every generation plant mango trees that everybody else is eating mangoes. So to carry on a spiritual path in its integrity, brahmacharya is needed. It's very important that there are a few people for whom the truth is more important than their lives. When you are trying to establish a spiritual path that will live on for generations after you, it is not possible without a solid tradition of brahmacharya. Celibacy, he points out, is only a small part of the picture. Brahmacharya is a life of inclusion, not exclusion, as people suppose. The brahmachari looks away from the you-me relationship because he wants to establish an all-inclusiveness within himself. Brahmacharis are people who have decided that they don't want to extract joy from anything or anyone. They want to source their own inner joy. In that sense, the whole world needs to turn to brahmacharya internally. It doesn't have to be about a practice, a vow, an external lifestyle for everyone. You can be married and still be a brahmachari. It means you're ecstatic by your own nature, and that's how it should be. He once recounted a story about the Sufi mystic Jalal-ul-Din Rumi. When Rumi went to the home of his beloved and knocked on the door, his lover asked, "Who is it?" Rumi replied, "It is I, Rumi." The door did not open. Rumi was so much in love that he wept for days altogether. Again and again he went to the door. Each time the voice asked, "Who is it?" Rumi said, "I, Rumi, and I am willing to die for you." The door stayed shut. One day, after all this turmoil and suffering, he arrived at a different state within himself. He went to the door once again. The voice asked, "Who is it?" Rumi replied, "It is you," and the door opened. Sadhguru paused, like a seasoned raconteur, and added, "That is the whole process. If a spiritual practice is part of your life, it doesn't work. If it has become you, it is still not enough. It has to become more than you, more than your life. That's what brahmacharya is about." A sannyasi who was initiated into brahmacharya in the second batch in 1996 relates an amusing incident behind his initiation. He was still wrestling with the whole business of Sadhguru-hood that had suddenly enveloped his old friend and mentor. And yet the deep and unreasonable trust in Jaggi was still intact. One day Sadhguru called him and casually asked him whether he watched films that starred Rajnikant, the matinee idol of South Indian cinema. When he said he didn't, Sadhguru remarked that brahmacharya wasn't any more difficult than giving up a diet of Rajnikant films. That settled it. The young man enrolled. And what about the irritants of community life? The rules and regulations, the challenges of living out one's life according to the dictates of the Guru, the structural pecking order, the regimentation. There have certainly been moments of frustration, he concedes, but I see brahmacharya as a process, not an irrevocable one. That helps. Besides, the big advantage of this life is that your spiritual process, your interiority, is entirely taken care of by Sadhguru. Why would anyone in their right mind give that up? Is there no resentment at being subjected to a life of unquestioning obedience? What makes me trust Sadhguru, he replies with quiet logic, is the fact that he's a man who values his freedom. That makes me confident that he'd never do anything to compromise mine. Somu was puzzled and alarmed by the rapidly lengthening list of ashram norms during the wholeness program. It scared me. I followed Sadhguru one evening to his room. It was dark, and I remember he was carrying a torch. We stopped at his door. He looked at me, and I told him impulsively, "Juggy, I don't want any rules." He flashed the torch in my face. He must have seen the tears in my eyes. He said gently, very gently, "Okay, no rules for you." What makes that moment memorable for Somu is the fact that Sadhguru hasn't reneged on his promise. Even today, Sadhguru tells new initiates during meetings that he has made a promise that there will be no rules imposed on them, says Somu, now Swami Guru Bhiksha, explaining that there is more of an inner party democracy at work within the monastic order than is apparent to the outsider. Sadhguru still says, if there are any guidelines that you feel are unjust, just raise the matter at the proper forum and we'll change them. I trust him all the more now because I see that he never goes back on his word. For Kavita, a young woman who recently plunged into brahmacharya, the commitment is about unfolding adventure rather than straitjacket conformity. It's about living on the edge, walking consciously. It challenges you to be conscious, alert, every moment. I've always dreamt of a situation where everyone is fired up and dedicated to dissolving the limitations of their personality. And here it is. A schoolteacher in Arkansas, Kavita decided to spend time at the ashram after doing some courses with Sadhguru in the US. I was already experiencing heightened levels of energy, clarity, and vibrancy, and I thought I'd turn myself into Superwoman and go back. I was also struck by the volunteers here, their dignity, grace, and gentleness. Trying to emulate Sadhguru seemed ambitious, but trying to emulate these people was an inspiring prospect. Before she knew it, she'd enrolled for a teacher's training program and found her lofty aspirations deflated. It was humbling. I had thought I had to climb, conquer, and be the best. But becoming a teacher is about unlearning, melting, becoming a conduit. I found myself growing more childlike, playful, unrestricted. I liked the change and decided to stay on. My goal hasn't changed, yet there is a subtle but significant shift of emphasis. Earlier, I wanted to make myself a person of worth. Now, I want to unmake myself, so something worthy can shine through me. The more casual I seem, the more serious I am, Sadhguru has often said. Those who have taken life-changing decisions after conversations with him testify to that. Recently, another disciple, now a brahmachari, relates how Sadhguru called him and offhandedly inquired whether he intended to apply for brahmacharya. "No," replied the disciple. "Why, still looking for a beautiful wife?" Sadhguru asked lightly. The disciple replied, hesitatingly, that he enjoyed his sip of morning tea far too much to think of renouncing it. "Oh, we'll concoct a far more potent brew for you," replied his master breezily. And that was that. Another one joined the ranks. The brahmachari admits that he does think about a steaming cup of masala chai every now and then, but the intensity of the craving has distinctly fallen away. If the transition from friend to ceremonial figure was difficult for his early disciples, the impact on Viji was obviously much greater. For a woman of simple ambitions, essentially to be a wife and mother, she now had to confront a major threat to her dearly held desires. An emotional and impulsive woman, fiercely proprietary about her husband, she suddenly found the man she loved turning into collective property. Besides, she had never regarded herself as particularly spiritual. She had seldom been particular about her sadhana. And though she worshipped her husband, she found it strange that others perceived him as a guru. To many of us, it appeared that he was her greatest barrier, her biggest limitation, says an early disciple. It was clear to us that he was a master, but to her he was still a husband, and she was deeply possessive of him. Some of us felt she wasn't being very supportive of him in his new role. For the practical, no-nonsense Bharati, Viji's temperament remained incomprehensible. She often found herself impatient with her master's wife. Once I asked Viji, "Why are you earning a pittance, doing some mundane job in a bank? Why aren't you here in Coimbatore, sharing your husband's fabulous work?" When Viji replied that she couldn't resign, given how financially uncertain her husband's life was, Bharati was disappointed. It was so clear to me that what this man was holding out to us was the ultimate possibility, but it saddened me that she couldn't see it. She said that she missed the earlier life with her husband before he took up this mission. But I always wondered, surely this whole adventure is much bigger than anything any of us has known? Why doesn't she want to share in the excitement? Sadhguru, on the other hand, had foreseen Viji's phase of psychological disturbance years earlier. At an early meeting, he had studied her palm and told her that she would go through an emotionally unsettling period 11 years later. He was also able to see that the new scenario wasn't easy for his wife. She was bewildered by the rapidity of the changes in our lives. I would keep warning her that things would change, that she shouldn't lose her mind when I changed gears. But nothing really prepared her for it. The proximity of the relationship was such that at some point she had started thinking, "This is my man." The pace of the change, the level of traveling, the months of homelessness with a child in tow was too much for her. It wasn't easy living in other people's homes as the Guru's wife, and I know I was often treated differently from the way she was. Then she also knew that my time was ticking away, that she didn't have very much time with me. It was a pressure cooker situation. I put her through tough times. But later, the moment she sat with her eyes closed for the Dhyana Linga consecration, she did superbly. The change in Viji was gradual. By early 1996, she decided to resign from her bank job in Bangalore and move to Coimbatore. Around the same time, Sadhguru refused a share in his parents' property. Both these decisions seemed impractical and unworldly to their close friends, but there were other things on their minds. After her move to Coimbatore, Viji's commitment to her daily practices increased. She was the first, along with Suman, to enter the meditation hall at 4:30 every morning. She seemed to be quieter, less obsessed with her husband, and performed her various roles as wife, mother, disciple with greater ease and grace. The transition from child woman to adult seemed to have happened. It was not entirely unexpected. It was also at this point that one of the most momentous events in her life had begun to unfold. She began to realize the centrality of her role in Sadhguru's mission. For it was with Viji and Bharati that Sadhguru proposed to embark on his lifetime objective of establishing the Dhyanalinga. In a sense, these two were an obvious choice. Their lives had been plotted a lifetime ago in a small temple in Kudapa. Their lives had been fixed, says Sadhguru matter-of-factly. They didn't have lives of their own. They never had, not even in their childhood. Although they were involved in so many things, one part of them was never involved. One part of them was totally elsewhere. And when the possibility of the Dhyanalinga came in front of them, they just knew that they had to go all out. After 3 lifetimes of preparation, he was in no doubt of what needed to be done. He describes the highly sophisticated yogic process simply. The whole process was to make the energies of the Dhyanalinga so subtle, beyond which there could be no form. Beyond a point of subtleness, energy won't be able to retain a form. So the idea was to take the energy to that ultimate point of subtlety and encase it in a certain way that it stays there forever. It is locked in a particular way. This consecration process doesn't involve any mantras or rituals. It is purely an energy process involving people. This is about making your life energies malleable. Right now, it is established as an individual. So developing the people involved in this process, putting them through years of sadhana, making them malleable and using these energies is how we created a situation where something much higher was invited into that space. That's how the consecration happened. In June 1996, Sadhguru initiated Vijay and Bharati into a process of intense practice, one that involved a blurring of boundaries between them on the energy level. Initially, I thought I would do it with 14 people, 7 women and 7 men. That was the whole purpose of the 90-day wholeness program. People were put through very intense kriyas and other kinds of sadhana. We were in a hurry to dissolve certain karmas. We had no time to wait for these things to happen in their life, so everyone was put on fast forward for them. Trying to create those 14 people who could be in such a state that their contact with the body would be minimal, but would still be stable enough to sit there and do what was needed, didn't happen, even though an enormous effort was made. Creating 14 people who are one in body, mind, and emotion, and who are in sufficient states of readiness, is not an easy task. I tried this for maybe a little more than a year. I identified those people, but I didn't tell anyone who they were. I tried to work with them, but I realized it was going to be difficult. Either they had the energies but didn't have the brains, or they had the brains but no energy. Time. It was all a question of time. So I decided to take a more drastic step, to work with 3 people. This was a high-risk process, but keeping 2 people in control was so much easier than keeping 14 people in absolute control. The idea was to create a triangle of their energies. Vijay and Bharati were to be the 2 points and Sadhguru the apex. In addition to the convenience of numbers, the 2 represented disparate and yet complementary temperaments. While Vijay was volatile and emotional, Bharati was dispassionate and logical. Vijay was to represent the female energy, Bharati the male, and Sadhguru the Ardhanari, or the androgynous principle that integrated male and female energies. Having fixed both their energies in a previous lifetime, he was in no doubt that they would deliver. Bharati's energies had already been superimposed in a particular way, so she had 2 pingalas. Since he had anticipated that the Dhyanalinga consecration would need a woman who operated as a man. The process was going to be a high-risk one for all the participants. Your energy body can just snap when you put yourself through that kind of rigor, admits Sadhguru. You know, if I made them sit for meditation, it was like 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours. Unmoving, they just sat through the night. Every day the process started from 6 or 7 in the evening and went on till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, non-stop. That's not something everybody can take without the necessary sadhana. These were people who had lived in comfort. Their previous sadhana sustained them, but still, there was always a tremendous risk that any one of them could just pop on my hands. Vijay's initial reaction to the plan was one of apprehension and deep resistance, but she gradually acquiesced. Perhaps, says Bharati, She had begun to see by then that if you wanted to be a part of Sadhguru's life, you had to be a part of his work. Viji revealed to Sadhguru at this time that she had frequent dreams in her childhood of three people sitting in a triangular formation, engaged in some activity. The whole project and her role in it seemed foreordained. It seemed futile to resist. Bharati has no clear recollection of being formally asked to be part of the consecration process. All she does recall is being asked one full moon evening to join Sadhguru and Viji in a meditation process. I sat for meditation, initially a little apprehensive about what my role would be, she says. But in the presence of Sadhguru, once I close my eyes, no apprehensions or doubts remain. Some other force that doesn't seem to be mine takes over, and I settle in almost immediately into meditation. The same, and something more, happened on that full moon day. Some indomitable force and energy seemed to be surging, a force I couldn't contain. My whole body twisted and turned, and I lost control over my physical senses, though I was very much aware. The process took me over, and I felt my interiority cleansed and rid of many unnecessary internal turbulences. The body became so sensitive, and towards the end, an energy form which I was not familiar with had taken over. The deep energy contact that I experienced left me so limp in the body that I needed Viji's help to stand and move afterwards. When Sadhguru suggested to Viji and Bharti that they spend more time with each other in order to facilitate the process, neither was particularly enthusiastic. For me, Viji was always just Sadhguru's wife, says the outspoken Bharti. We had never interacted socially. I've never been very comfortable with emotional people. Neither of the women had anything against each other, but apart from their devotion to Sadhguru, there was little in common. In the beginning, the interaction proceeded haltingly. There were times when nerves jangled and tempers flared. For what was being proposed was, in fact, outrageously simple and hugely challenging all at once. The voluntary meltdown of individual personality to facilitate the creation of a single entity, nothing less than the harikari of personal identity, in fact. There were so many deep layers of resistance in people, says Sadhguru. I literally tore through their karma, kept it aside and put them together. Otherwise, there was no way these people could have come together. They were willing to become friends. Beyond that, they wouldn't go. Is there anybody with whom you're willing to merge and become one? It is not so. You just believe it at certain moments, but it's not so. It wasn't easy. In addition to the voluntary abnegation of identity, the thinning of borders between three people meant a loss of personal privacy and a sudden acquisition of a whole heritage of thoughts and memories. After the two people were brought in to create a triangle of energy with me as a pivot, It was necessary that they become one in their mind, emotion, and energy, says Sadhguru. Now, if this person felt something on his left knee, the other two also felt something on their left knee, wherever they were. What was your life and what was their life was all mixed up in your mind. Let's say you, me, and somebody else are, right now, in a triangle. You didn't know what happened in my life 10 years ago, but suddenly now you know. And what happened in your life 25 years ago I didn't know, but suddenly now I know. It all got so mixed up. We didn't know whose memory was whose. The mind became one. The emotions became one. The energy body also became one. As the process deepened, Bharati suddenly knew details about Viji's life that she had never been told before. Even more uncannily, she was aware of exactly what Viji was thinking at certain points of time. Even when I was at my home in Coimbatore, I often knew exactly what she was eating, or when she was having a bath. But because we were pretty involved in certain processes by then, it didn't really amaze me. The process that Sadhguru had initiated them into was, by his own description, pretty drastic. It was like creating a triangle of energy as an invitation to the divine. Once you create a triangle, it is like a vortex. It is a certain fierce possibility. It just sucks everything in. In the process of sucking in the divine into their collective energy swirl, the participants also attracted more than they'd bargained for. One day, Viji and Bharati were bewildered by a cacophony of voices around them during their meditations. Purnami, meaning full moon, and Amavasya, meaning no moon, were a very significant day for practices relating to the Dhyanalinga consecration process, says Bharati. One Amavasya, as I was meditating with Sadhguru and Viji at the shrine, I heard hushed whispers and felt a certain jostling around me. I was unsure, thinking that my imagination was running riot. But the hushed voices persisted. A few days later, when the whispers seemed to have reached a crescendo, Bharati remembers a hand on her shoulder and another body pushing against hers. She opened her eyes and was distinctly aware of a group of figures sitting huddled together beside her. It was then that Sadhguru explained that these were simply disembodied beings drawn to the spot by the possibility of personal liberation that had suddenly opened up. These were exalted beings, released from everything, but they still had a little karmic structure. Total dissolution had not happened yet. So, once you reach that dimension of energy, you can hear their karmic structures just playing on, like a tape recorder. Both Viji and Bharati were clearly able to hear many people talking all at once. Any human being would have become terrified. But it seemed very natural then, in that situation, because the two were raised to a higher level of energy. I never expected them to take it so well. They went through these kinds of experiences in full awareness. They were not hallucinating. They were not hypnotized. And they were not under any kind of intoxication. They were in absolute awareness, more aware than anybody could normally be. For Bharati, the powerful energy field around them was such a real experience that any rational argument now seemed trifling and irrelevant. I have always scoffed at and ridiculed anything that is beyond logic. But slowly I started keeping the mind aside and gave myself totally to the consecration process. For all their wariness, both Bharati and Viji were anxious to transcend their petty differences to assist an enterprise of obvious significance. The process started unfolding at a more rapid pace than Sadhguru had believed possible. By October, the momentum had picked up to such an extent that he was confident that the goal of 3 lifetimes was clearly in sight. I didn't know how fast or how slow the process would be. But once we put them together, everything happened beyond my expectations. They're almost like two opposite poles. One person was all reason, another person was all love. When these two qualities came together, it was like one beautiful person with all the qualities. They became like a complete human being. But then it became too overwhelming. Keeping these two people rooted in their bodies became difficult. So we had to stall the process for some time. One thing was, these two people had their families to take care of, their day-to-day life in which they had to be totally involved. Another thing was, they had to maintain very high levels of energy and give themselves totally to the consecration process. So they needed to acquire the necessary maturity, balance and freedom within themselves to be able to handle this. The difficulties didn't disappear, but they were now manageable. These two people were complete opposites, says Sadhguru. Normally they couldn't even sit together because they were in two totally different worlds. Now you have to merge them together. One was pure logic, the other was pure emotion. Though they did wonderfully together when we were in the consecration process, they didn't go out of their way to make it easy for me. I enjoyed it all. It was a huge challenge. Bharati remembers the distinct change in Viji once she began to realize her role in the bigger picture. The amazing thing about Viji, she says, was that once she decided to cooperate, she gave herself totally to the process, despite her struggles. Maybe she was left as choiceless as I was. I don't know. Maybe she still carried her insecurities afterwards. But when we sat together, we were both totally involved. In some ways, she was more giving than I was. I'm sure there were times she feared and loathed me, but she was also fond of me. Perhaps the advantage of being emotional, like Viji, she reflects, is that you can bring love into your heart, and then maybe things begin to happen. At the same time, the rational Bharati was also aware that a shift was taking place within her. She acknowledges that, until then, a certain part of her had always been somewhat scornful and dismissive of Viji. It felt like, by being married, my master had allowed himself to be subjugated to someone who was irrelevant. But the process initiated a subtle change of perspective, a softening on her part as well. Both of us were possessive of Sadhguru in different ways. When we sat for this process, our personalities were no more a hurdle. Through Sadhguru, a deep level of connection began to grow between us. The warmth increased. Besides, the processes were so powerful that I began to see Vijay less as a human being and more as a certain kind of energy. I always saw myself as an instrument for Sadhguru. There was no personal choice about it. Despite my ego and my eccentricities, at the time of the process I could just empty myself and sit there and allow him to do what was necessary, and so could Vijay. I had a certain respect for her because of that. And yet it all seemed much too smooth and harmonious to be true. I knew something had to go wrong, says Sadhguru. I knew a project as mammoth as the Dhyanalinga could never be established without something going wrong somewhere. The anticipated hurdle was social. That was where things had gone wrong in an earlier lifetime. Sadhguru instructed his disciples to be particularly careful in their interactions with the outside world. Social goodwill was essential to this undertaking. Little did he know that the seeds of the problem lay much closer to home. More than 2 decades ago, when Juggy was still a happy-go-lucky collegian, he happened to be ranging the hills of Karnataka on his motorcycle. He had run out of food, but that was nothing new to him. He had been in situations like this before. But after 5 days of near starvation, he was determined to get himself a meal. At this point, he happened to glimpse what looked like an ashram on a hill. He turned his bike in that direction right away. When he reached the building, instead of dismounting, he rode right up the 15 steps to the cottage. It was an unceremonious entry. Scruffy and unwashed, his clothes crumpled and soiled after days in the wilderness, Juggy was not a particularly prepossessing sight. The guru of the ashram, Swami Nirmalananda, revered as a saint in those parts, stood at the head of the steps. In his present condition, Juggy was unsure of the reception he would get. But to his surprise, the Swami smiled, walked up to him, and to his utter stupefaction, touched his feet. The gesture rendered Juggy speechless. He had no clue how to respond. At that moment, some constriction within him seemed to crumble. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew that for some inexplicable reason he had been honored by this saint, and he was moved. I never got off my motorcycle unless it was a must, he recalls. So I rode up all the steps right to his residence. I was covered with mud and slush from head to toe. This man was over 60 years of age. I was just about 20. He was known to be a great sage and saint. I never was interested in sages or saints. I was just hungry and I wanted food. There was no other place to go. There were no restaurants around. I said, I'm very hungry. I need to eat something. And I had a few rupees in my pocket I could pay. He just looked at me and burst into laughter and tears and fell at my feet. This shook me. I had never bowed down in my life to anybody. Now I can bow down to anything, even to an ant. But at that time I wouldn't bow down to anything, and this man coming and touching my muddy boots disturbed me a little. Then I just shook it off and said, "Okay, I'm hungry. You got some food?" He said, "Come," and he made me sit down. He wanted to unlace my boots. I said, "Don't do that." They were filthy. So he baked bread for me. Not very good bread, but he didn't have anything else. And he had honey. He gave me honey and bread, and I ate it all up. He just sat there tending to me like I was a little baby. I ignored all that. I ate and left. Swami Nirmalananda was a silent saint. He had spent several years in silence and communicated only through notes and letters. After that meeting, Juggy visited him several times, often carrying an offering of fruits with him. Since he had never seen himself as a spiritual seeker, he never sought any guidance from the Swami. But their relationship grew, and the two spent many companionable moments together. I remember sometimes he would speak to me, but most of the time he would converse with me through notes. He was always warm, and I warmed to him too. I didn't bother about whether he was enlightened or not. That didn't mean anything to me. I didn't want to concede that I was going to a spiritual person, because spirituality and I just didn't go together. But I started liking the guy. It became like a silent kind of love affair. He was a wonderful human being, and he lived gently. If he wanted to offer flowers for his daily worship, he would wait for the flowers to fall. He would never pluck from a tree. And he ate only fallen fruit. He'd never pluck them off the tree. He was that kind of man. After Sadhguru's spiritual life unfolded, he grew far too busy to maintain contact with the Swami. But soon after his marriage, he took Viji with him to the Swami's B.R. Hills ashram. The Swami welcomed them silently. Initially, he seemed unable to place Sadhguru, whose appearance had changed considerably in the past decade. I had a full beard now. Viji was with me. I was gentler. From the wild, strapping youth I had once been, I had now grown a little tamer, says Sadhguru wearily. But when Sadhguru introduced himself as Juggy, the Swami's eyes suddenly brightened. "The motorcycle man," he gestured. Sadhguru nodded. The Swami then wrote something on a piece of paper and handed it over. It read, "I recognized your smile." The Swami had always considered the smile to be an important index of a person's personality and spiritual development. He welcomed us, and he made us sit down, says Sadhguru. Every time I went after that, you know, even before, whenever I went, he gave me a can of honey. That's one thing he always had as a gift for me. He always gave me 2 or 3 liters of honey to carry home. We would have a long conversation. He would write his questions and I would speak. Every day he wrote a minimum of 80 to 100 letters. This is the way he kept in contact with people around the world. After that meeting, he started writing letters to me. I was traveling most of the time, so I didn't reply very often. I didn't have a desk of my own, no home, no hearth, nothing. I was traveling so much at that time. Once in a way I wrote back. He never traveled. He hadn't traveled for probably 20 years. He didn't step out beyond the 2 acres of the ashram. He just lived within those confines. The ashram was located on a cliff. He would sometimes go to the edge and look out at the mountains and valleys and come back. That's all. That encounter was significant in many ways. It was Vigi's first meeting with a man who would change her life goals in a way she never imagined. She took an instant liking to him and was eager to visit him each time they were in Mysore. It was also memorable because of a dangerous incident the couple encountered on their return journey. As they hurtled homeward through the jungle on Sadhguru's motorbike, they suddenly found themselves disturbingly close to a wild elephant. Juggy turned off his engine. Vigi clung to him terrified. There was less than 3 feet between them and the beast. The elephant stood facing some trees and evidently hadn't seen them yet. Just behind was a small sloping path. The elephant sensed human presence and turned. It was now or never. Sadhguru plunged his bike downhill, whizzing right by the elephant. The beast trumpeted loudly and seemed to lurch in their direction. Vigi, who hadn't expected them to move, was alarmed by her husband's daredevilry. She was angry and crying and beating me up, saying, "Have you gone mad? Why did you do that?" "She was so terrified she peed in her pants," laughed Sadhguru, who had never laughed away the incident, even on that occasion. In June 1996, Sadhguru and Vigi, along with their daughter, visited Swami Nirmalananda once again. He was older now and looked somewhat worn and listless. He had emerged from his phase of silence. He told Sadhguru that he had lived as a yogi and wanted to die as one. Reluctant to linger on as an invalid, he said he was keen on shedding his aging body before the next summer solstice. He had already built a small samadhi for himself. In the course of the meeting, he had many questions for Sadhguru about the Mahasamadhi state. His chief concern was how to leave the body without pain or discomfort. He said he was 73 and wanted to die as a yogi, not a rogi, an invalid, says Sadhguru. He wanted to know if it would work, what exactly would happen, all sorts of details. That's the first time I opened up about this subject and spoke to him about a completely different dimension. What it is that stops a person from leaving, how to overcome these hurdles. I went into certain details. As Sadhguru clarified the Swami's doubts, Vigi listened intensely to the conversation. She had become an inadvertent witness to a highly advanced esoteric discussion, one that would customarily have never been conducted in the presence of a neophyte. As she was listening to all this, she burst into tears, recalls Sadhguru. She just cried and cried. I ignored her and continued to speak, because Vigi was capable of crying for any reason, for joy, for anything. She was so overwhelmed by what I was saying that she couldn't stop. Nirmalananda also started weeping every now and then, and he continued asking me questions. We went into great detail about matters I have never spoken of anywhere. Viji was unusually quiet on their return journey. In an effort to cheer her up, Sadhguru stopped the car and reminded her of their close shave with the wild elephant on the previous visit. But she didn't smile. I was trying to make light of the whole thing, but she was in some kind of mood. I was just standing on the road. In front of me was this incredible view. My daughter was playing around nearby, and Viji suddenly fell at my feet. She said, "I want to go like him." I said, "You want to go? Just jump off the hill. What's your problem?" I was just trying to joke and dismiss the whole thing. She said, "No, I want to live like he is, consciously. I want to live like that." I said, "Okay, when are you going to leave? Tell me the good news." I was still joking with her, but she was overflowing with emotion and tears. She said, "No, I am really serious. You must help me." It was then that the alarm bells began to ring. Viji's role in the consecration of the Dhyanalinga was pivotal. This desire for Mahasamadhi couldn't have been more inopportune. Sadhguru knew it could not be allowed to get out of hand. But that was just the beginning. Subsequently, Viji often raised the subject of Mahasamadhi with her husband. He saw she was in dead earnest and refused to be distracted. It was disturbing, but Sadhguru was aware that she was still a spiritual novice. She had neither the maturity nor the intensity required to attain her goal. It was a process that demanded sadhana, and Viji had never shown any inclination for sustained practice. Thankfully, she was still unripe, unready. What he hadn't bargained for, however, was her determination. Because after that day, Viji was a changed person. Her face had a new luster. Her life was infused with a new sense of purpose. From that day she was another person altogether. People who knew her were aware of how frivolous she was, most of the time acting like a 6-year-old girl. But suddenly, in the last 8 or 9 months, she became all focused. It all started from that day. I said, "Okay, are you willing to do some sadhana? Let's see how seriously you do it." I never thought she would have the perseverance to stick to it, like forever. It takes 24 hours of attention, of commitment. I never thought she'd have the determination for that. At the same time, I didn't want to deny the possibility to anybody. Sadhguru was already far too preoccupied with architectural plans for the Dhyanalinga shrine to pay much heed to any warning signs. As Viji's sense of resolution increased, he was only peripherally aware of the change. In any case, he was confident that she would never be able to accomplish such a feat on her own. If there was anyone who could do it, I thought it would be Bharati, because she had a certain dispassion about her. But Viji was always clinging to me. I never thought she was capable of it. He mentioned it to some people around him, but they laughed it off. If anyone seemed singularly incapable of Mahasamadhi, it was Vijay. It seemed a distant and unattainable aim for the most single-minded spiritual seeker. Even with her new-found maturity, Vijay seemed far too whimsical and erratic to qualify as a candidate. I gave her some very simple sadhana, but she went very intensely into it, he says. In a few months I saw she was going really far. She even started talking confidently about leaving in another 6 months or 8 months. Then I tried to discourage her, slow her down a little. I reminded her that, after all these 12 years of being on the road, we finally had a place to live. For the first time, she had a place where she could call her own. She could cook and keep house. I knew these things meant a lot to her. Our daughter was going to be 7, and Vijay herself was just blossoming. After a certain phase of immaturity, problems, struggles within herself, things were working out well for her. So I said, "Why now? What's the hurry?" She said, "Right now I'm feeling absolutely beautiful inside and outside. Everybody is wonderful to me. I don't know how long I will be able to maintain this. All my life I have been confused. I have been in turmoil, had emotional upheavals. Right now I am in a place where I want to be. Tomorrow, if something happens to my child or to you, I may again allow that to affect me. But right now nothing matters to me. I am in that state. This is the time for me to leave." I had no argument with that, because I know it's true. I said, "Wait a few years, enjoy this, and go." But she said, "Right now you don't want me to go, but after a few years maybe you will." Sadhguru laughs at the recollection. Against such wisdom I had no argument. So I made some attempts to discourage her as a husband, but as a guru I couldn't stop her. The consecration practices played their role in giving an additional fillip to Vijay's resolve, bringing her dream within her reach. I wanted the people involved in the Dhyanalinga to be in certain states of samadhi, says Sadhguru. One aspect of samadhi is your contact with the body becomes minimal. It can be brought down to a one-pointed contact. We call that nirvikalpa samadhi. It means that your contact with the body is minimal, like a thread. If you break that thread, then it is Mahasamadhi. But it's nice to hold a single thread and continue to live, because then you are almost free from it, the body, and still alive. There are a few things you have to do. You still have to eat a little, go to the toilet, but in every other way you are free from the bodily process. It's a good way to live. Normally when people are like this, we keep them in certain levels of inactivity and safety. We keep them in a protected atmosphere. We don't expose them to outside situations, because with the smallest disturbance they may leave the body. Just a pinprick, and they may leave the body for good. But when we were consecrating the Dhyanalinga, I wanted people who were in samadhi states but still physically active. This was risky, but the process required it. So I was teaching them how to be active. This gave Vijay a tremendous opportunity to develop a certain capability. She started going all out. In October 1996, Sadhguru happened to be planning his program schedule for January. At that point, he had a sudden intuition that the proposed classes wouldn't be possible. He decided to cancel them. I told Raja, I feel the programs in the last week of January will not happen. I don't like this. Push it to the first week of February. Raja asked me if I had any personal engagements. I said, no, I just feel programs fixed for that time may have to be postponed. Others around him asked why, but he could offer no explanation. By the end of November, the edifice of the lingam had arrived in the ashram. Sadhguru now undertook a journey to Sambalpur, in Orissa, to initiate the renovation of the Mukteshwar temple there. He took Vijay with him. It proved to be a strange trip. A senior disciple recalls that after visiting the temple, Sadhguru started walking through the surrounding forest at a great pace. It was night, and a few people followed him. When he reached a small pool of water, fed by the river Mahanadi, he suddenly stopped short. He signaled the others to halt and continued on his own. He walked around the pool and abruptly stopped before an old tree. He gazed at it for a long time, tears streaming down his face. Then in one swift gesture, he removed his garland and placed it on the tree. This act evoked equally baffling responses from the bystanders. Some wept, others fell to the ground and rolled, as if possessed. The atmosphere seemed charged with an intense energy. When he returned to Coimbatore, Sadhguru revealed that he had in fact visited a temple that he had known intimately in another lifetime. Bilva was trying to shift a large group of people from his tribe to Sambalpur, and had often camped beneath this tree with his family. It was amazing how the tree had stood all these centuries. No one had brought it down. This old tree had died, and just the bark remained. Inside that, its offspring grew within the shell of the old tree, so it was the same tree in a sense. In December 1996, Sadhguru took Vijay and several inmates of the ashram to visit Swami Nirmalananda. He seemed physically weak, and it was clear that the day of his Mahasamadhi was not far. He was a man at peace with himself, and his presence struck the visitors as sacred. Some were moved to tears. The Swami consoled them. "I may not be here the next time you visit," he said quietly, "but you will be able to feel my presence everywhere." His advice to them was to remain fearless. He assured them that they had a guru who was capable of leading them to the highest spiritual attainments. "Trust him and be true to your sadhana. He will do the rest," he said. The last few months had been difficult for the Swami. His announcement of his Mahasamadhi had provoked a controversy. Rationalist groups in Karnataka labeled this an attempt at suicide, and led to a vociferous protest against what they saw as an obscurantist practice. There was even a police inquiry at the ashram. When we went there, there were 2 police constables in the ashram, says Sadhguru. He held me and wept. He said, See, I have not even plucked a flower from a single tree in this ashram all my life, but they've actually posted policemen in my ashram. I said, why are you bothered? Two men sitting here, what are they going to do to you? He said, but they think I'm going to commit suicide. I said, you don't bother. You know you just have to do this, this, and this. And I went through details of what needed to be done. But he was distressed because the police were monitoring him all the time to make sure he didn't take his life. The Swami eventually released a statement in which he explained that for someone who had lived a long and spiritually fruitful life, the decision to leave the body was as natural a process as an old leaf falling off a tree. For a man who has attained self-realization, he said, the body becomes an unbearable burden. Others could have no idea of just how painful it was for such a person to retain his hold on the body. This non-violent and conscious relinquishing of the body, he said, had many honorable precedents in the country's spiritual heritage. He requested the protesters not to create any unnecessary confusion in the minds of people, and asked to be allowed to make his final exit in peace. The 73-year-old Swami eventually left his body on the 10th of January 1997. On a fine January afternoon, says Sadhguru, he came and sat in his samadhi. With about 55 people there to witness this, he just left. The police couldn't catch him. The rationalists argued he must have taken some poison, he must be post-mortemed. But how could a man who had consumed poison walk to a samadhi, sit cross-legged and smiling, and leave like this? The last meeting with the Swami made a deep impression on the Isha meditators. Watching the Swami and Sadhguru together, says one meditator, was special. It was the day of the Arudra Darshan, the Tamil festival celebrating the cosmic dance of Shiva, considered to be the longest night in the year. Seeing them together on that occasion gave the moment an added significance. It was like seeing the sun and moon together. In the third week of December, Sadhguru telephoned Bharati. He asked her if she would join Vijay, his daughter, and him on a fortnight's car trip. Although reluctant to accompany them on what she assumed was a family holiday, she agreed. It meant making arrangements for her family again. But by then, I'd learnt to scheme, she smiles. Since it was the Christmas Pongal time, my kids had school holidays, and I sent them off to my brother's place in Hyderabad. She left with Sadhguru and his family on 26th December. No one had any clue to the purpose of this trip, and none of them, not even the participants, guessed how path-breaking it would prove to be. Although the Dhyanalinga work was proceeding apace, Sadhguru was aware that certain karmic barriers remained and impeded the complete integration of the two participants in the process. While Vijay and Bharati were quite willing to cooperate, there were unconscious areas of constraint that still needed to be addressed. The ideal way to disentangle those deeply buried knots was to jointly visit places that were of importance to their previous lives. Bharati, who was as clueless as Vijay about the purpose of the trip, recalls times during the journey when she felt it would have been easier if she hadn't accompanied them. It was becoming clear to me that Viji was possessive about her husband and insecure about the way in which young people were increasingly regarding him as a godlike figure and going crazy about him. She also made what I thought was a foolish comment to Sadhguru about wanting to attain Mahasamadhi. I felt it was like a child talking about a Barbie doll, and I asked her, why Mahasamadhi? Why die? Why not live and assist him? She would just retreat into her shell when I said such things. I felt a certain anger towards her at the time. Anger that my guru was married to someone who couldn't understand the magnitude of his life mission. Now I think I could perhaps have been easier on her. I never understood her pain as a woman and was often condescending. But that was because I couldn't understand why she wanted to reduce him to just a husband, when he was obviously so much more than that. The first halt on the journey was Sambalpur, on the western border of Orissa, a town with a considerable tribal population. It is located 16 kilometers south of the Hirkud Dam, an ancient center of the diamond trade, and currently famous for its textiles. It is also a well-known center of Vajrayana Buddhism. The group headed for the small Mukteshwar temple, about an hour's drive from Sambalpur. As they approached the ancient temple, Bharati was distinctly aware that the place was not new to her. It evoked a mix of longing and grief that grew increasingly unbearable in intensity. The powerful feelings made her turn silent and withdrawn. In the course of the journey, Sadhguru explained several things to Viji. The reason we were making certain visits, their significance, and so on. For me, there were not many questions. I had already had certain glimpses during my samyama programs that made many scenes instantly familiar. The three meditated at the temple for 3 days. Bharati slipped into her meditation practices easily. She found the place electrifying in its energy, and was often unable to stand after her meditations. A senior disciple, who had made arrangements for both their visits to Sambalpur, now noticed that Viji seemed decidedly different from the way she had been on her visit just a fortnight ago. Her approach to Sadhguru was less casual, more reverential, and there was something indefinable about her own presence that induced respect. Now Sadhguru decided to pursue the trajectory of Bilva's life. He knew that the snake charmer's hometown was likely to be somewhere in the vicinity, but he had no idea of the name of the town or in which direction it lay. Undeterred, the foursome plunged into what may have seemed to any onlooker to be a wild goose chase, an uncertain search for an unknown destination. They had no map, no clues, no leads. It was a journey that could have taken them months to accomplish. And yet they encountered no blind alleys. They were traveling by jeep, and Sadhguru directed the driver, guided entirely by his intuition. He navigated the vehicle to the town of Raigad in Madhya Pradesh, on the other side of the Orissa border. As the jeep drove in, Bharati was assailed again by an overwhelming sense of déjà vu. The place seemed achingly familiar. She had no doubt that someone very dear to her had lived there. They headed directly to a small Shiva temple. As soon as she set foot in the shrine, Bharati knew it was the temple she had seen in a vision during her second Samyama program. The sound of temple bells had often haunted her dreams as a young girl. The sound of this particular temple bell was exactly the clangor to which she was so accustomed. Ever since I was a child, there has been a small, far-away temple in my vision. As soon as I saw this Shiva temple, I knew that I used to come here as a young girl to worship in an earlier lifetime, she recalls. For Sadhguru, the experience was just as alive. That Raigad street was just the way it had been. Everything was as I remembered it. The same Brahman colony, the temple, everything. Soon after, this temple was renovated, but at that time it was as if everything stood still in time, just waiting for us to revisit it and recognize it. After meditating in the temple, Sadhguru led the party to a tree outside the temple. It stood before a stream, and although it stood among several other trees, there was no doubt that this was different. It still pulsated with a raw energy, instantly recognizable to the visitors. 400 years later, it could still transport the travelers into another dimension of space and time. It was here that a young man had breathed the last few minutes of his life. When Bilva fell, Sadhguru says, it was face down. The energy of that body was just intact when we approached the tree. Nothing had changed. And those last minutes in Bilva's life, as Sadhguru points out, was spent by some intervention of grace in full awareness. That's why breath watching at Isha is always tinged with venom, Sadhguru has often said. Elsewhere, breath watching is a very cool process. At Isha, it is very hot. Here, if you sit and watch your breath, it drives you into a maddening frenzy. It's like you are on the edge of life and death. That's because this man watched his life breath when it was ebbing away. The awareness did not come easy. It happened when his breath was almost gone. On their return journey, the group passed through Vishakhapatnam in the state of Andhra Pradesh. Here, too, Sadhguru decided it was time for exploration. Luck was on their side again. Every detour seemed intimately linked to the main course. Every digression proved to be just another lane home. Sadhguru had often asked Bharati about a place that was likely to be in the Rayalaseema area of Andhra Pradesh. He did not know its name. Since she belonged to the coastal part of the state, she was unable to help him. Now, the group decided to deviate from their plan again. Instead of returning to Coimbatore via Bangalore, they decided to drive to Hyderabad. After spending a night there, they hit the road again. 4 hours later, they approached the small town of Kudappa. Guided yet again by Sadhguru's unerring inner radar, they drove directly to a Shiva temple. A silence descended upon Sadhguru as they neared the shrine. Bharati experienced a familiar upsurge of energy as she entered it. She knew immediately that this was the place in which she had spent time with her master in an earlier lifetime. It was here that Sadhguru Sri Brahma and his faithful disciple, had created a blueprint for the Dhyanalinga, plotting the lives of future disciples right down to the wombs in which they were to be born. The travelers meditated here for a while. The place, they learned, had lain derelict for several years and had only recently been renovated. For some reason, Viji found that she was unable to look Bharati in the eye during their time at the temple. Although Bharati was puzzled by this, a part of her knew why. There was a marked change in her attitude and body language at the temple. I knew that a great deal had happened here between me and Sadhguru, and felt suddenly protective of him. I knew I had seen my master in a state of pain and defeat earlier, and I didn't want to see him fail again. I felt a fierce determination, and whoever came in our way seemed insignificant. There was also a certain indignation. Why has my master, my guru, this king of kings, chosen to get married in this lifetime? It was later that she realized that the time she had spent with Sadhguru Sri Brahma in the temple in her previous lifetime had been a period of great hardship for both of them. It was a time when her attitude towards her master was protective to the point of being belligerent. The powerful energy of the temple had stirred that deep-seated ferocity again. This inexplicable mood change, not surprisingly, intimidated Viji. As they drove away from the temple, however, the surge of aggression abated as swiftly as it had arisen. The immediate fallout of the trip, Bharati recalls, was that it released her from a few small fairy tale attachments she carried towards certain relationships and events. This reduced the tension between her and Viji considerably. The cleansing hadn't taken place on a purely psychological level either. Something deeper had happened. And Sadhguru's daughter inadvertently confirmed this. When they returned from one of their long meditations in one of the temples, she ran spontaneously up to Bharati, calling her Amma. She realized her mistake a second later. The incident was subtle, but an important testimony to the fact now they both exuded energies that were far more harmonious than before. It had been a whirlwind tour. They had covered 6 states and 5,000 odd kilometers in 12 days, and 6 of those days had been spent driving, with many of the nights spent in the car itself. But for the travelers, it had been much more than a hectic trip. They had actually zigzagged through several lifetimes, their journey opening their eyes to the many independent strands that wove together the tapestry of their lives. No wonder Sadhguru termed it a karma yatra. It was nothing less than a pilgrimage, a chance to dissolve deeply embedded blocks and unconscious identifications by revisiting their past histories. On their way back, the Dhyanalinga suddenly seemed less remote and dreamlike. It looked like an imminent possibility. As we were driving back, I made Viji and Bharati take a vow that by the next Purnami in February, we would finish the consecration, recalls Sadhguru. I said, no matter what family compulsions, no matter what it takes, we will finish it. They agreed. I said, that's not enough. You have to really take a vow. So I actually made them shout it out loud 3 times, and they did. Although he was exhausted, Sadhguru immediately called for a satsang, eager to share with his disciples the fruits of their journey as well as news of the breakthrough that it represented. "I've nothing to show you, but definitely have brought a tremendous gift for you," he announced. He described the Karma Yatra as a journey so free of hitches that it seemed as if the whole existence was waiting for us to do it. He instructed Vijay and Bharati to sit at either end of the hall, creating a triangular formation. He then led the group meditation, which his meditators remembered for a long time afterwards as extraordinarily powerful. "It was such a powerful experience," he was to say later. "These two people went through a fast forward of life, a quick progression. So many events of their past life just happened. I would describe the place exactly before we would enter the town, so that doubts didn't arise in the minds of even these two people. They shouldn't think that they're only imagining those things. I would tell them how the vibrations would be, which chakra would get activated when you walk into the place, and it would be exactly the same in their experience. It couldn't be any different. Whether it is Kudapa or Sambalpur, we know exactly where to go, because once we start approaching that place, the vibrations are such that the past connection just pulls you there. We could have chosen so many other places where both their pasts were involved or where their pasts were separately involved, but we wanted to go to those places which were of spiritual significance. When we went there, the spiritual dimension became a living experience for both of them. So when they went through these kinds of processes, all the structures which were holding them were shaken loose. After that, the consecration became very easy. Even before that, the urge to break the karmic bond was there. The sadhana was there towards that, but this acted like an extra boost. And so, the goal seemed nearer than ever before. But intimations of trouble were already in the air. It was soon after the Karma Yatra that Bharati left for her family home in Vishakhapatnam to celebrate Pongal. On the way back from a trip to her father's ancestral home in her native village, one of her sisters-in-law suggested that they stop and visit a local saint named Vinaka Babu, who lived by the Godwari riverside. With her long-standing mistrust of godmen and temples, Bharati was reluctant to join them. But since the saint's home was on the way, it seemed churlish to refuse. Venkana Babu was venerated as a holy man in the area, and was believed to be gifted with powers of prescience. He entertained a small assembly of visitors every Saturday evening. It was his practice to emerge after long hours of prayer and meet his gathering. He would stand before them with his eyes closed and a silver flute in hand, listen to their questions, and offer his advice. Bharati and her sisters-in-law trooped into his simple home. The visitors sat before him in a row on the floor. Each person was given their chance to ask a question. When her turn came, Bharati was silent, but the saint continued to wait. When her sister-in-law nudged her, she felt obliged to ask a question. "My guru wants to establish something," she said awkwardly. "What do you think about it? Will it happen?" There was a pause. Venkana Babu's eyes remained closed for a length of time. Then he spoke. There is something that Sadhguru seeks to establish, he said, but it will not happen as soon as he desires. There will be difficulties. There will be delays. There was a pause. Then he added, Your Guru is no ordinary being. He is vaster than the ocean. But the present circumstances are adverse, and they will take their toll upon his health. His final words were of reassurance. You are walking a certain path, he told Bharati, and it is the right one. When Bharati reached Vishakhapatnam that night, she called Vijay and Sadhguru immediately. Anxious not to dishearten them, she mentioned the barest details of her encounter with the Venkana Babu. I told Sadhguru that he had said there would be some hiccups in the process. I also told him that he should take care of his health. Vijay told me that Sadhguru already seemed to be anticipating some delays. When she had asked him whether the consecration would be over soon, he had fallen silent. She said he seemed to know something would be amiss. It worried her. Bharati herself was not unduly worried by Venkana Babu's prediction. Sadhguru seemed to be in control of the situation. The consecration seemed nearly complete, and she couldn't anticipate what could possibly go wrong at this stage. She was struck, however, by the reverence with which Venkana Babu had spoken of Sadhguru, despite never having met him. In the meantime, Sadhguru had taken Vijay to Bangalore for a cousin's wedding. In the 12 years that we have been married, we both had been so busy that none of my relatives, other than my immediate family, had ever met my wife. I never went to any of the family functions. I never visited anyone, because I was always traveling and teaching, building a whole new family, in a sense. So I decided to go because I wanted everybody in my family to meet Vijay. By now, after the Karma Yatra, she was glowing like the full moon. People who saw her in those last few weeks could clearly see she was different. Everyone met her, and they all said, Wow, what a wife you have. No wonder you never came to see us earlier. All that stuff. But the grand family conclave was also something of a leave-taking. Although no one but Sadhguru and Vijay had an inkling of it, I knew that she was preparing for her Mahasamadhi, and that after the consecration was over, by February-March, she wanted to leave. He did hint at it, but no one took it seriously. They wouldn't believe it. They said, What nonsense! She is so beautiful and joyful. Why would she suddenly go? The couple visited Vijay's parents as well as Sadhguru's family in Mysore. His mother's death ceremony was on the 18th of the month. I gently mentioned to both sides of the family that Vijay had been saying she wanted to go, that she may not be around for too long, says Sadhguru. My father dismissed it as rubbish. Others were a little taken aback. 22nd January 1997 is a day that Bharati remembers vividly. She was back from Vishakhapatnam by then. The doorbell rang that night. It was Vijay at the door. She said she had come to Coimbatore to conduct a satsang and had decided to pay Bharati an impromptu visit. Bharati invited her in and served her dinner. Vijay gave her some pongal prasadam from Bangalore. I remember she was looking very nice that evening, and I told her so, says Bharati. There was something mellow about her. She seemed particularly at ease with herself. 23rd January was a full moon day. Sadhguru had told them that he wanted to complete the Dhyanalinga consecration either that day or by the next full moon. But Bharati had her daughter's school play to attend that day. Although she hadn't mentioned it to Sadhguru or Viji, she doubted that she would be able to make it to the ashram that day. Viji didn't ask me if I was coming for Purnami, and I didn't tell her about my plans to go for my daughter's school program either. Later, I regretted it. If I'd gone to the ashram that day, it's possible things would have been quite different. At that time, however, none of them knew just what was about to happen on the 23rd. Probably not even the person who set that dramatic turn of events in motion. For her, it was still a plan. A fierce, all-consuming plan, perhaps. But plans, she knew as well as anyone else, were notoriously unreliable. The events of the day unfolded unremarkably. Ma Gambhiri remembers that Viji handed over a diary to her early that morning and told her to mark Sadhguru's engagements in it. It puzzled her a little, because Viji had always been in charge of his appointments, and there had never been the need for such a diary in the past. But she put the event out of her mind as she busied herself with her duties in the kitchen. Sadhguru did notice that Viji had risen early that morning and done her sadhana. After a few hours, she had a bath and did her sadhana again. She repeated this procedure several times. At 10 o'clock, he had lunch with her. There was a monthly teachers' meet that day, and participants recall Viji championing the cause of a few teachers who were singled out for criticism. There was nothing significant about this. Viji was often vocal in her support of ashram volunteers and teachers. I remember I was supporting Sadhguru on some point, and Viji strongly opposed it, says Raja. She left for her home at 4:30 that afternoon. The special full moon meditations began at dusk. It had been part of Viji's sadhana for a few months to cook and serve the brahmacharis and brahmacharinis by hand on full moon days, says Swami Devasattva. We'd assemble in the shrine in Sadhguru's home, and the two of them would feed us handfuls of bisi beli bhat, followed by curd and rice. But first there were meditations. Sadhguru remembers that Viji suddenly rose in the middle of the meditation and left. He was puzzled, since it was unusual for anyone to interrupt the meditation. I had my eyes closed, but I knew when she got up and walked away, he recalls. I was a little irritated. Nobody dares to just get up and walk away from a meditation. Once they sit, that's it. Within about 8 or 10 minutes, she got up and walked away, and within 5 minutes she came back and sat down. She had gone to the bathroom and left all her jewels there, from the toe ring to the nose stud. These are things that a woman in India doesn't remove normally. These are things that are never spoken or written about. But if there is metal in certain strategic parts of your body, you cannot leave your body by accident. So whenever anybody comes to the ashram, if we put them through any kind of intense sadhana, the first thing we do is give them a simple copper ring to wear. It was only much later, after everything was over, when I went to the bathroom, that I saw that all Viji's jewelry was placed next to the wash basin. She had removed it, come back and sat down. When she sat down, she must have realized that this metal has been the only thing holding her back. There was a sudden explosion of energy. Within 7 minutes of her return, she was gone. Swami Devasattva remembers the scene clearly. She was sitting on Sadhguru's chair. She was chanting with the rest of us. The next moment, she just sort of fell to one side. I remember there was a smile on her face. There was a flurry of consternation. Someone informed Sadhguru that Viji was not waking up. In a moment he was by her side. He worked ceaselessly on her chakras, while the others looked on, uncomprehending. It was not entirely unusual. People had slipped out of their bodies during meditations before, but they usually returned. An hour later, Sadhguru looked up. His eyes were wet. "She's gone," he said. "She left through her anahata." The news reached Bharati when she was in the middle of the school program. As soon as I heard, my first thought was, "Oh my God, this woman did it." I felt a grudging admiration for her. Then came anger. Why did she have to do it now? How will we complete the process? Sadhguru's daughter, 7 years old at the time, reports her version of events with an impressionistic clarity. The message that her mother was unwell reached her in boarding school. By the time she reached the ashram, she knew something was wrong. When I came in, people were bawling. I saw my dad crying, my mother lying on a bed full of flowers. It was 3 in the morning. I was tired. I hugged my dad. I remember I said I was sleepy. She had realized what had happened, she says. But no, she had no questions. Weird stuff was always happening around my parents anyway, she says simply. I was used to it. Having sat with her father on the dais during the wholeness program and several Bhava Spandana programs, she was accustomed to the sight of people weeping, staggering, and experiencing a whole gamut of states of altered consciousness. The next day I saw people pulling out of the ashes from the pyre, she says. I remember wondering then, how do they know the difference between bones and logs? On some level, her mother had prepared her for this day. Just a few days before the event, when they were driving her back to her boarding school in Uti, Viji had told her that she wouldn't be with her for her birthday that March. The girl had listened silently. She recalled Sadhguru remonstrating with Viji for needlessly worrying her. Viji had replied that she knew she wouldn't be able to retain her body for more than 2 Purnamis. Sadhguru too recalls that conversation. She was telling the girl that she would be gone before March, so I would come and meet her instead. The two of them were just talking in a very matter-of-fact manner. I said, "Why are you doing this to the girl? Just leave her alone. You don't know whether you will go or not." But she said, "No, no, I have to tell her. I will definitely go." She had announced that she would leave on a full moon evening, some 8 months ago, and had started working towards it. She was very clear about it. We came back on the 21st evening from Uti. The 23rd evening is when she left. This sounds like a fairy tale, but it is true. Sadhguru's daughter remembers Viji as little more than an archetypal mother figure. She remembers her as the woman who decorated her hair with hibiscus leaves and white flowers, who did her holiday homework with her left hand so no one would know she'd done it for me, and who would bring her home-cooked food to school on parents' visits. I didn't really know who she was, but I still feel I kind of do know her, she says. I intuitively know what she'd have liked and disliked. Recently, on Vigi's 10th anniversary celebrations, another facet of her mother's identity was revealed to her. Listening to people's responses, I thought, oh my God, maybe she wasn't just my mother and my dad's wife. I realized suddenly that there had been much more to her. Not many had realized just how much more to Vigi there was. It was her Mahasamadhi that brought it into sharp focus. Behind her emotions, there lay an intensity that none of us had guessed, says one of the sannyasis. I'd always seen her as a thoughtful person, a considerate one. I remember how she gave me one of Sadhguru's warm woolen shirts because I'd joined the ashram without bringing any winter wear. I remember the packets of Little Hearts biscuits she'd always send for me with Sadhguru every time he returned from Bangalore. But she was also very volatile. Many of us thought that her love for her husband was the biggest barrier to her spiritual growth. But there was a change in her after the consecration work started, and in the end she got what she wanted, before any of us did. Others remember her warmth and great capacity for affection. Whenever Sadhguru rebuked me, and that was pretty often, Viji would immediately leap to my defense, remember Srinivas. She had talked to me about Mahasamadhi just a week earlier, says Raja. We often discussed it. I had visited Swami Nirmalananda as well, and I had been moved by that meeting. I used to tell her that I longed to attain it too. While he had never anticipated that she would leave as soon as she did, he wasn't entirely surprised either. The atmosphere was different in those days. Sadhguru seemed far fiercer, more intense. We were younger. The unexpected didn't surprise us. We were full of confidence and hope. Everything seemed possible. 1,000 people attended Viji's funeral. Sadhguru remained in his home for 10 days after the ceremony. Ashram residents remember him pacing furiously up and down his veranda, his face a study in grief. On the 11th day, he conducted a special aradhana or memorial function. 3,000 attended it. It has always been hard for me to explain to people what Viji is, he announced to the gathering in a short but moving address. When I say Viji, I am not referring to her either as my wife or as a woman, just as a being. As a being, she has always been truly wonderful in my experience. But as many of you know, she was a person of very intense emotions. In her childlikeness, she never knew what should be expressed or what should be held back in a group of people. Whatever emotions were within her always found expression, irrespective of the situation. A husband's loss struggled with a guru's pride. This is not child's play, he reminded the assembly. Even accomplished yogis would struggle to attain this. As some of you now know, Swami Nirmalananda, who spent his life in spiritual sadhana, in the last few days before his Mahasamadhi, was in doubt about whether it would be possible for him or not. And that's what he expressed to me when we visited him for the last time. With divine grace, he attained Mahasamadhi. Even a jnani who had spent his lifetime in spiritual sadhana struggled to attain this. To throw this life out of this body without injuring the body takes something else. One has to generate a tremendous amount of energy, which requires intense sadhana. Vijay knew the methods to achieve this, but at this stage we never imagined that without my assistance she would be able to generate the necessary energy. The swiftness with which she has achieved this was just made possible with her love, probably the only thing she knew. When I look at the whole series of events, it is very clear that there is a direct intervention of the divine. It seems like Shambho, that her heart was crying for, has taken her by the hand. Out of sheer love, she made it possible. His pain was palpable, but he did not miss the opportunity to point out that Vijay's Mahasamadhi was not a mere individual's triumph, but an inspiration to many. For all spiritual seekers, Mahasamadhi is the ultimate goal, the very culmination of their sadhana, a chance to dissolve into divinity. Whenever you get an opportunity, let people know that even this kind of opportunity is available to man, that it is possible to take hold of the very process of birth and death into one's hands. Generally, people believe that all these things are over with the sages and rishis of ancient times. But spirituality in its highest possibility is still very much alive. The public at large has come to the conclusion that the age of genuine saints is over. Now the present situation here is clear proof that it is not, and it never will be. I did not wish that at this stage anybody here should leave the body and go, but she aspired for it, and she has dissolved into the Maha Mantra Shambho. It is not for me or anybody to ask whether this is right or wrong. He added quietly, I am not big enough to question him. He has often described devotion as the quickest and most intelligent path for the seeker. Devotees often look like a bunch of idiots to the rest of the world, but the wisest ones are always devotees. This is a kind of different wisdom which logical minds can never understand. It was clear that while Sadhguru was aware that Vijay was going to leave her body, he had no idea it would be so soon. She was determined to go, he says. I often told her that after 12 years we finally had our own home, a growing child, some stability in our lives. But she was adamant, and I knew I couldn't stop it. In the last few months her very breath had become Shambho. But I thought she would leave a month later. I believed the consecration would be done by then. He remembers that on their drive back from Uti, a couple of days before her Mahasamadhi, Vijay, who had been chanting Shambho as she usually did, suddenly began weeping. She clutched his hand and asked him to stop the car. When he complied, she declared that he was the only Shambho she had known in her life, and begged him to help her realize her dream. Sadhguru lightly replied that even if she didn't know Shambho, Shambho certainly knew her. if you remain sincere about what you're doing, you will definitely experience him and know him beyond my form. No one, he added, could deny her that dream. She seemed comforted by this. After their return, she pursued her practices with increased fervor. But perhaps there was another subliminal motive that underlay Viji's resolve to attain Mahasamadhi, the fear of outliving her husband. It scared her. The fact that he was going to die at 42, says Bharati. I do remember her saying she didn't want to live after him. One still can't help wondering how a yogi of Sadhguru's attainments could have been unaware of the imminence of Viji's departure. I was anticipating an impediment, but I thought it would be social, he says, pointing out that for centuries social norms had been the traditional obstruction in the path of the Dhyanalinga. So I instructed all the people around me to be extremely careful not to get into any kind of trouble anywhere, not to create any kind of resistance with anybody, because I knew something was coming. I thought I'd fixed the situations around me sufficiently, though on one level I knew this was coming. The situations around me and what was demanded out of me at that moment blocked my conscious cognition. Besides, he adds, Viji was not an accomplished yogi, and her departure was not as premeditated as it might have seemed. Though her leaving was very much of her conscious will, she had no moment-to-moment control over the life forces. But the last few minutes before she left, she was aware, and accommodated the dissolution of herself by removing all the metal on her body in the form of ornaments. When the divine descends, you just accommodate. Even if her husband had had no clue of the course of the events, the heavens seemed to have colluded with Viji in her single-minded aspiration. It was a very special day in terms of the way energies were moving for the planet, Sadhguru explains. This was an exceedingly rare and archetypally appropriate planetary alignment, a moment in time expressed in the heavens as a perfect six-pointed star. This pattern comes on the exact day where three outer planets, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune, are conjoined together for the first time in almost 200 years. On 23rd January, this cluster of planets centered on the first degree of Aquarius, joined by the Sun, with the full moon opposite them all. This pattern may also be seen as a symbolic representation of the long-heralded dawning of the age of Aquarius. It is also the Thaipusam, a day that many sages of the past have chosen for their own Mahasamadhi. Sadhguru's voice holds a definite note of exultation at his most unlikely disciple's attainment. As a husband I was in shock and grief. She had lived like my shadow for 12 years. There was not one moment when she was not there. But as a guru, I was proud. She had accomplished her ambition through the intensity of her emotions. She just dissolved into her love, and she left without doing any harm to her own body. She simply discarded it like an old garment. When a person leaves in full awareness, shedding the body without causing any injury or damage to it, that person is truly no more. She doesn't exist as a being any longer. It means she has just melted away. The game is up completely. Particularly significant was the fact that Viji had not undertaken any fast or penance before her departure. Even if I were to leave my body, I would prepare for it. I would not eat for at least 24 hours before the event, Sadhguru admits. But she did it effortlessly, without any obvious preparations. Such a simple process of sadhana I gave her, but she just took it to such heights. It's very rare. The effortless exit of a 33-year-old woman in perfect health was a source of wonder to many. But there was also a very real grief. A concise tribute to her memory comes from Srinivas, a man of few words. Viji, he says, was an ordinary woman capable of an extraordinary amount of love. He is among the many who miss her. She was one of the most natural and spontaneous people I've known, says Ma Karpuri. Initially I felt anger at her departure. I wondered why Sadhguru hadn't prevented it somehow. Now I realize that perhaps her Mahasamadhi happened at the best possible time. She would have faced tough times ahead, as the scale and significance of Sadhguru's sphere of activity increased. But for all of us, her going meant a vacuum, says Raja quietly. Now I feel like I'm part of a great organization, but she had made me feel like I was part of a family. Viji's ashes were buried in the shrine adjoining her home. Several meditators still choose to spend silent hours at this small and unostentatious spot. There is a quality there that's special, says Hora, an ashram resident. I never knew her, but when I sit there, I feel I do. There's a gentleness there, something soft, a great sense of peace. Sadhguru himself has testified to this. Although the concept of Mahasamadhi does indeed mean that there is no residual personhood, a person's fragrance, he says, cannot be exorcised. For this being, there is no more bondage of a physical body. Her name is Vijaya Kumari, which means victory's daughter. The highest possible victory for any being became hers. But even if the flower is no more, still the fragrance can remain. And the fragrance of this flower is forever. It's never lost. The physical fragrance may die, but the energy fragrance that we're talking about can't be killed. That corner of the ashram nurtures a very different type of energy altogether. It is very mild, very subtle, very pleasant and beautiful. If you sit there for a while, it can give you a bodiless kind of feeling. That space is fundamentally anahata. It's like a solvent. It can slowly melt you down. On another occasion, as we were walking in the garden around his home, he remarked, "That woman knew nothing about the spiritual life. She had no great accomplishments. She was as ordinary can be. She had been through bursts of devotion and confusion all her life. When she managed to hold on to that devotional spell for long enough, she made it, just like that." He carelessly tossed a petal in the direction of her shrine. "She left my home empty, but our hearts full."